Hey everyone, my name is Bryce, and this room is really hot right now. And you're watching Bryce About Music, and we're going to push through the heat today because there has never been a more important time to go back 40 years and talk about music from the 1970s. If you've seen any of our other countdown videos, we're going back 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and today we are going back 40 years to 1978 to go through a countdown of the top 10 albums of 1978 from today's perspective. Of course, my biased perspective, but today's perspective nonetheless. And just like in our other countdowns, if you agree with anything that's on the list, disagree with anything that's on the list, think I might have forgotten anything, let me know in the comments. Got it? Let's get started.
Number 10.
At number 10, we start the list off with Hemispheres from the Canadian progressive rock band Rush. And I'm not going to argue that Hemispheres is the best or most accessible Rush album, but in many ways it is the most Rush album. And what I mean by that is that it is their most complex, their most technical, and easily their most progressive. So much so, in fact, that this album took a huge toll on the band and signaled their transition into more accessible albums immediately after, with projects like Permanent Waves and Moving Pictures. And while as a progressive rock album, it may not reach the heights of Rush's 1976 masterpiece 2112, the first track on this album is the closest thing to a follow-up that Rush ever did to 2112. It is essentially a near 20-minute track that makes up the entire A-side of the record. It's called Cygnus X1 Book 2, and it's the sequel to Book 1 from Rush's previous album, A Farewell to Kings, and has all of these different instruments and sounds that are new to Rush. You have Alex Lifeson working with more classical sounding guitars, including a 12-string, an acoustic guitar, synthesizers, and various pedals. Neil Peart adds a timpani, wind chimes, a gong, to his ever-growing and comically oversized drum kit, and even Geddy Lee as a vocalist hits higher notes here than he was comfortable with and from what we've heard on previous Rush albums. And again, while it doesn't necessarily reach all of the variation of 2112, Rush is so exceptional at using their technical instrumentation to create such a strong variety that intersects with their storytelling. It's not just simply that their instrumentals are more complex, it allows their whole songwriting to be more ambitious than their progressive rock contemporaries. But Hemispheres is a lot more than just an ambitious A-side. Its B-side is made up of 3 somewhat shorter tracks, and the first one, Circumstances, is one of the heaviest songs that Rush had made at this point. That leads into The Trees, one of the most memorable pop-length songs that Rush has ever crafted, a story about a metaphorical conflict between oaks and maples. It's certainly one of the most progressive sounding songs that Rush has made in that short length. That leads into the first fully instrumental piece that Rush ever released, La Villa Strangiato, a 9-minute, 12-part track that is easily the most complex piece of music that Rush had crafted at this point. Hemispheres is rock's most virtuosic musicians going as far as they possibly can. It's the album where Rush flew as close as they possibly could to the progressive rock sun, and they stayed at a safer distance for the rest of their career because of it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's their best album, and it's certainly not their most important or the one that I would recommend going to first. That is probably still either 2112 or Moving Pictures, but it's easily their most technically impressive and probably even their most consistent.
Number 9.
At number 9, we have Lanquidity from Sun Ra, one of the greatest and most unusual legends in jazz and experimental music history. Sun Ra was somewhat of an enigma during his life. He routinely referred to himself as an alien from the planet Saturn, but his futuristic sounding music and constant adherence to the avant-garde did its best to back up that claim. Sun Ra's cosmic sounds and space-age persona would help create the Afrofuturist aesthetic, which would greatly influence 70s funk music like Parliament Funkadelic, and Sun Ra recorded a monumental number of albums, but this is one that has stuck out. In the late 1970s, jazz was borrowing more from rock and funk music, and artists like Miles Davis and Freddie Hubbard were even getting in on that, releasing fusion albums around this time. And while it may seem strange that one of the most experimental jazz artists of his time, someone who was a pioneer for introducing polyrhythms to jazz and was playing electric keyboards in the 1950s, would release a fusion album, this is one of the best of its kind, and quietly so, as it was forgotten for nearly 30 years after its release. It didn't see much distribution until after Sun Ra's death, but because this was one of his most accessible and most purely fun albums to listen to, it ended up becoming one of his most popular after a reissue in the year 2000. And like you might expect from a Sun Ra album, all of the songs here have a very cosmic feel to them, but they also have a very laid-back vibe. But despite that, there's a lot going on between keys, guitars, all different types of saxophones, drums, and the vast amount of instruments that Sun Ra himself plays on the record. In my experience, jazz is rarely as repetitive as what fusion artists brought to the table, but Sun Ra uses that to great effect. He uses the repetition of fusion and the groove of funk music to create a simple foundation to build layers of complex music upon. There are busier sections that sometimes feel like there are multiple solos going on at once, but it all comes back to this main groove, and boy, is there a groove to this record. It's a masterclass of layering and tension and introducing the complexity of jazz into simple, digestible grooves. Lanquidity is simultaneously one of the most accessible and one of the most complex jazz fusion albums, while also being one of the greatest achievements of its genre and one of the greatest achievements of Sun Ra's career. And needless to say, it's fantastic that this album has been reissued and is more accessible today because it was so hard to find in 1978, and you probably wouldn't find it on end-of-year lists when it first came out. But nowadays we have the capability to go back and appreciate one of jazz's lost gems.
Number 8.
At number 8, we have the debut album from Japanese synth-pop pioneers Yellow Magic Orchestra. The band's most famous member, Ryuichi Sakamoto, who went on to release a number of great ambient albums as well as score films like The Revenant and The Last Emperor, released his debut album, Thousand Knives of Ryuichi Sakamoto, in 1978 as well, but it's more apt to say that Yellow Magic Orchestra was led by Haruumi Hosono, who would go on to release the first album of entirely video game music in 1984. But keep in mind that full video game soundtracks were still a relatively new thing in 1978. Space Invaders, from an audio perspective, was a pioneer of using fully looped music in video games. This album was released just months after Space Invaders hit arcades, and one of the first sounds that you hear on the entire album is a sample from Space Invaders. And in many ways, Yellow Magic Orchestra was the first proper video game album. It was the first album to sample video games, as well as the first tribute to the sounds of video games in a relatively early stage. But in doing so, it was far more than just a novelty. This album also ended up influencing electronic music and techno, as well as hip-hop and even future video game music. And the song Computer Game leads directly into a reinterpretation of Martin Denny's Firecracker. And the two tracks combined ended up being an international hit. And it makes sense, as Firecracker was among the hardest and fastest electronic songs that had been released at the time, and the whole album feels like a digital sounding dance party with influences from traditional Japanese music as well. It's like if Kraftwerk were Japanese and stuck inside a computer. The sound was created using a mix of live instrumentation, electronic drums, and a Roland MC microcompressor, a new type of synthesizer that was used on this album. The vocals use an early form of vocoder and have this robotic effect to it. And while Yellow Magic Orchestra would go on to refine their sound and make more consistent albums in their future, this one is still charming. There is something really unique and really ambitious about the starting point. It's such an unusual album, yet so simple, so easy to dance to, and such a loving tribute to an art form that I love in video games that I still return to it and love it to this day.
Number 7.
At number 7, we have the fourth album from legendary British heavy metal band Judas Priest. It is called Stained Class, and this album changed metal music forever. Judas Priest, of course, one of the bands that came after Black Sabbath as part of the new wave of British heavy metal. But Stained Class was the album where they separated themselves from not just Sabbath, but from the other bluesy 70s hard rock bands like Led Zeppelin and Aerosmith. This album was faster, heavier, darker than anything else in rock or metal music. Just the opening track, Exciter, starting out with a hard drum solo, followed with dueling guitars, and Rob Halford just soaring over the music. There was nothing else like this at the time. And if you've paid attention to metal music in the last 40 years, so much of it is about getting more technical, heavier, faster, and that wasn't really Black Sabbath's thing. They were heavy, certainly, but they weren't going for speed, and they weren't playing music that was anywhere near this complex. Stained Class was the album that set the tone for Motorhead, Metallica, Iron Maiden, and it also set the tone for the future of metal lyricism with lyrics that frequently mentioned violence and death. Although ironically, it was the one cover song, Better By You, Better Than Me, that caught the contention of concerned parents as the band had to appear in court 12 years later over alleged backmasking in that song. But of course, there isn't anything actually satanic about Stained Class. I don't need to tell you that. This is just a great metal album, just a little heavier, little darker, than what people were used to at the time. And in terms of what people were used to, there was no one in metal at the time like Rob Halford. His voice just soars over this heavy dynamic music, and he sounds in full command of the music beneath him. Halford will hold notes and let his vibrato shake with the heavy metal around him. And even on the one power ballad here, Beyond the Realms of Death, Halford is able to show an even stronger vocal range over the slower sections of the song, and that track is barely even a breather from the intensity because of the gut-wrenching lyrics throughout its 7 minutes. And Judas Priest would become a household name with albums like British Steel and Screaming for Vengeance, but Stained Class is the album that set the tone for the future of heavy metal music. It's a bona fide classic of the genre that, even with a band as famous as Judas Priest, isn't always given the credit it's due.
Number 6.
At number 6, we have The Modern Dance, the debut album from Cleveland garage punk band Pere, the first of 2 albums that they released in 1978, the other being the excellent Dub Housing. But this very strange gem of a punk album is my personal favorite of theirs, and quietly one of the most influential avant-garde rock albums of its era. The Modern Dance was one of the first albums to be considered post-punk and art punk, and it grew from the sounds of Captain Beefheart and other experimental rock bands as it embraced the avant-garde and musique concrète sounds of experimental music, and it created a noisy and dissonant sound that used feedback as part of its rhythm, with a saxophone, synthesizers, tape loops, and barely intelligible vocals from David Thomas, who has one of the most distinct voices in the history of punk music. And underneath all of the chaos and high-pitched noises and all of the different avant-garde sounds going on, the actual rock riffs themselves are very strong. The album starts off with its catchiest song, Non-Alignment Pact, which is definitely noisier and has a more unusual vocal style than the typical punk of the era, but still has a familiar rhythm to it and is welcoming all the same. It only slightly prepares you for the experimentation to come along in the rest of the album. As once you start getting into tracks like Laughing with its wailing saxophone, or Over My Head, which is this slow jazz-like ballad where the saxophone and guitar sound like they're dueling it out, with multiple types of percussion and an almost chant-like vocal performance. And you start to see that some of these songs are just as much avant-garde jazz songs as they are punk tunes. You even have tracks that embrace wall of noise type sounds or heavy electronic noise, and across all of these challenging sounds is a dark and anxious atmosphere that's reflected in the tension of its music as well as in its lyrics. And these lyrics go from abstract and kind of silly sounding to downright dark and nihilistic as they progress. This was an album that reflected the industrial elements of the Rust Belt in the 1970s, and it sounded different from its British counterparts as a result. And of course, The Modern Dance holds up 40 years later. It's such an odd album that There's really nothing else like it in punk music. Yes, there were other avant-garde rock bands and other post-punk bands that were certainly influenced by it, especially when you look at how noise rock has progressed in the last 4 decades. But this is an album that captured a certain tension and anxiety of a time and place, and it's one that any fan of punk and post-punk should listen to, if not purely because it challenges the boundaries of that genre. And it's also one that any experimental music fan should check out, even if you otherwise have no interest in punk music or 70s rock.
Number 5.
At number 5, we have one of the greatest pieces of background music ever created, Brian Eno's Ambient 1, Music for Airports. And yes, this is where the term ambient music came from. You certainly had artists before Brian Eno that were making ambient music just by a different name. You had German artists like Tangerine Dream that had already been using synthesizers to create atmospheric soundscapes. And Japanese composer Isao Tomita used synthesizers as well to create more classical sounding electronic music long before Brian Eno. But still, Ambient 1 did more for the genre than just give it a name. These albums and plenty of others either had more in common with classical music or rock music if you remove the percussive elements of the rhythm. Music for Airports was more still. It set the structure in place for the spacious, all-encompassing feel of the genre going forward, and showed how you can make this a type of music that is both engaging to actively listen to and perfect for background music. This is an album that is essentially made up of 4 longer compositions that will slightly change over their running time. If you actively listen to it, you will notice how the sections repeat, how there's little changes each time each section comes in, and over the course of a couple of minutes, it will start to sound very different. However, if you're just listening to it in the background, you're obviously not going to notice as much, and it just sounds like soothing background music that has enough repetition to where your brain can latch onto it, but is changing enough to where you're not getting bored of it. It's perfect music to just kind of zone out to, but also music that has enough going on that you can listen to it and actively engage with it on a more intellectual level. Essentially, it's interesting background music, and it helps that each of the individual refrains, while short, are beautifully composed, and the parts of it that evolve are interesting enough to keep your attention. And nowadays we may think of Brian Eno more as an ambient producer, in part because he made 4 of these albums that were literally titled Ambient, but also because most of the albums that he composes these days are more in the ambient genre. But early on, he was making more whimsical sounding pop music and made a number of classic art pop albums. He had certainly experimented with this style of production before, especially on 1975's Discreet Music, which was literally a synth line that he intended for King Crimson's Robert Fripp to play over. But that album was not as actively engaging as this one. It literally was background music for another instrument. This one is both background music and active listening music for an audience. And even going back 40 years, I still enjoy how pure and minimal this album sounds. Its atmosphere still works, and I find myself drifting in and out of direct concentration with it, enjoying it just the same. It's obviously a classic of the ambient genre and incredibly influential to that style, but it's also just a great piece of electronic music and a brilliant style shift for one of pop music's most important producers.
Number 4.
At number 4, we have the 10th album from Robbie Basho, one of the greatest and most underappreciated American folk singers of all time. And this album, Visions of the Country, is absolutely gorgeous and showcases Basho's powerful voice and all of the vibrato that comes from it, as well as his fast finger-picking style of guitar playing that was a trademark of American primitivism, a style of folk music that was made famous by John Fahey. And just like with some of Fahey's later work, Basho was influenced significantly by Hindustani music, particularly Ravi Shankar, meaning that some of the songs on Visions of the Country use a more circular 16-beat pattern while also carrying an underlying drone that is common in Hindustani music. Rocky Mountain Raga, for example, is the perfect merging of Hindustani rhythms into an American folk song. And it works because at times Robbie's plucks are so fast that he can sound more like a sitar player than a typical American folk guitarist, but also because his voice sounds very circular as well. He has a tendency to slur his words as he slides in and out of different vocal ranges, which keeps with the circular patterns of the music. And it's atmospheric in a way that folk music rarely is. This album feels like a man alone on top of a mountain singing out to the open air. It's a celebration of the American countryside through a powerful, unique, and ultimately beautiful sound. And the lyrics on this album recall and pay tribute to nature. It's clearly an album about the world around us, and it has a personal nature-like feel in doing so. And there's even a piano ballad called Leaf in the Wind that has Basho whistling to mimic the sound of wind. Even the love song Blue Crystal Fire, which has Basho singing in this gorgeous falsetto with tons of vibrato throughout, is full of nature-like imagery. Basho's work in general clearly influenced the direction of avant-garde folk music, including freak folk and other styles that used drone as a large part of the music. But this album is still very accessible and just completely stunning. It's quietly one of the masterpieces of American folk music from one of the most underappreciated artists the genre has ever seen. And a huge reason is because this album was very hard to find until recently, which is the same for most of Basho's work. Visions of the Country was out of print until 2013 when it was re-released, and most of Basho's work was in a pretty similar space. In fact, when Basho tragically passed away at the age of 45, all 14 of his albums were out of print. But regardless of the reason, people let this album slip away in 1978. Don't make that same mistake 40 years later.
Number 3.
At number 3, we have Wire's answer to music's eternal question, how do you follow up a masterpiece? As just a year earlier, this English punk band released Pink Flag, an album that took punk music away from the verse-chorus-verse structure. And in 1978, they followed it up with Chairs Missing, an album that took that same experimentation and lack of typical structure and moved it into more expansive songs. This is an album that slowed down the aggression of Pink Flag and embraced noisy and fuzzy sounds as well as a dark and gothic vibe. It's an album that was more concerned with texture and atmosphere than really any other punk record of the time. And in doing so, it was so varied from start to finish. It continued the unusual song structure that was found in Pink Flag, as there are a few songs that are certainly catchy and a little bit more pop influenced than anything that was on their debut, with tracks like Outdoor Miner and I Am the Fly, even with its disturbing lyrics. But it also embraces more experimental sounds as well, such as wall-to-wall vibration from guitars, or the heavier use of keyboards and synthesizers, which became much more commonplace in post-punk going forward. And in doing so, Wire embraces different elements of noise, electronic, and progressive rock, as in things that were not associated with punk music at the time. Chairs Missing at times sounds like a very early noise rock record, a very early gothic rock album, an early sludge album, and while it has all of these different sounds and so much variety and it's so unstructured, Chairs Missing never sounds random because Wired are so good at building tension. And the music fits within the themes of the album that allude to pain, loss, and mental health. It's a dark sounding album that reflects that in its lyrics. And Colin Newman shows a very underrated vocal range as well, as he definitely shows his English accent very strongly in his singing voice, but he can range between this slow punk croon to outright screaming. And Wire would continue to experiment with electronic and different effects on later albums, particularly on their next one, 154, released a year later. Chairs Missing feels like a perfect balance between the intensity of Pink Flag and the experimentation of 154. There's simply so much here, from its musical experimentation to its abstract lyrics, that were simply not a part of punk music at the time, and it's such a brilliant expansion of the intense, straightforward, but still experimental sounds of Pink Flag. It's exactly what you want out of a follow-up, and it's one of the greatest works of punk and post-punk ever released.
Number 2.
Our number 2 album is Duckstab from The Residents, everyone's favorite mysterious group of talking eyeballs. Seriously, after 45 years, this band has still not officially revealed their actual identity. But The Residents are an avant-garde group that burst onto the scene in 1974 and immediately caught notoriety for their satirical mock-up of the Beatles' Meet the Beatles album cover. And while that album and some of their other early work explored more elements of sound collage and electronic, Duckstab is one of their earliest attempts at making experimental rock music. It was much catchier and more typically structured than other Residents albums, and honestly, you could put 2 Residents albums on this list, as their expansion into even more experimental sound collage with Not Available is also fantastic. But Duckstab was the rock inverse of Not Available, and it showed the Residents putting their quirky sense of humor and penchant for experimentation into a more familiar structure with outstanding results. The album starts out with the silly and slightly crude Constantinople, which is one of the catchiest songs the group would ever make, and just a few tracks later you have a ballad in Blue Rosebuds. Sounds pretty typical so far, right? Yet there's so much about this album that is strange. There's repeated vocal effects and off-kilter singing. The vocalist sometimes will be overly breathy, using a ridiculous falsetto, poorly mimicking Elvis, heavily distorting his voice, or just singing in a tone that straight up doesn't match the music. It ends up with a lot of the songs sounding dark and creepy and has this sort of Disney gone wrong vibe to it. Like the whole thing comes across as a parody of overly happy pop music. The album art of the guy smiling while stabbing a duck is the perfect representation of what the music on here is. It's dark, twisted, and completely surreal, but they sound jovial while performing it. And while the instrumentation is certainly more familiar than the vocals, as this was the first Residents album to feature guitarist Snakefinger, who was a frequent collaborator of the group up until his death in 1987, it's certainly anything but ordinary. There's a ton of digital sounds here and electronic instruments, and even the guitar-focused songs sound like they've been run through a million filters to create this vintaged and heavily distorted sound. It all sounded just the right amount of off. A perfect example of this is on Hello Skinny, a track that would famously be covered by Primus, a group that was very clearly influenced by this album. And on that track, you have an almost harmony. Like the layers on the singing are so close to being together and sounding beautiful, but it just misses. Clearly intentionally, but it ends up being very eerie as a result. And despite all of its strange sounds and the fact that it was initially intended as a compilation album between the EP Duckstab and a later EP called Buster and Glenn that was never released, this is actually a pretty cohesive album. It's fun and varied throughout, but the whole thing nails its creepy vibe. It's not quite as challenging as some of their more experimental and sound collage-oriented albums, but it's something special nonetheless. It created a type of pop rock album that only the Residents could make, and it paved the way for the weird outcasts of rock music to follow. It's the perfect blend of the truly odd and avant-garde and pure pop aesthetics, and it's a strange and lovely combination.
Number 1.
And our number 1 album of 1978 from a modern perspective is The Man-Machine from Kraftwerk. Kraftwerk, of course, a legendary German krautrock band, a group that had tremendous influence on electronic music, rock music, pop music, and this album was coming off of what many people consider to be their classic album, Trans-Europe Express. And while this album goes on to further refine that sound, there's something a little bit more modern sounding about the Man-Machine in retrospect. A lot of that has to do with how electronic focused, how dance focused this album is, and while in some ways it's even simpler than some of Kraftwerk's other work, there's some major similarities in this album to the type of dance music that is big today. The Man-Machine is a sci-fi themed album with robotic, synthesized vocals, and while sci-fi themes were certainly not unusual for electronic music at the time, this album was more playful, more more danceable than anything else that these other artists were doing. And with its themes and simple yet catchy dance rhythms, it inspired not just the next wave of synth pop, but also electronic musicians in the future, such as Daft Punk, but also Aphex Twin. And the entire album has themes of the intersection of human beings and technology. I mean, the album is called The Man-Machine for a reason. The vocals, of course, are a huge part of that, with how they're digitally altered to sound robotic, but the lyrics are also repetitive to an almost mechanical degree as well, and that works perfectly within the dance structure of the songs, particularly from a modern perspective where we don't typically think of dance music to have a ton of varied lyricism. You have songs like The Robots that have tons of beeps and boops and keeps going back to the line of "We are the robots," as well as the chilled out Space Lab, which has this futuristic vibe to it to go along with a fast drum beat. It sounds like the precursor to ambient techno. And with those vocals, this album had experimented with synthesizing a human voice to a degree that no other album had done before this. With things like echoes and rising pitches, it created a sound itself that feels like the combination of man and machine. And just to show how ahead of its time it is, the track The Model became a #1 hit in the UK 3 years after its release. And if you're going back to it for the first time today, this album has just aged so wonderfully. It has a little bit of 70s sci-fi charm to it, but it's so catchy and so chilling and nails the futuristic atmosphere that it's going for. And with the evolution of genres like house music and techno, you can start to hear the influence of this album in particular on modern pop music. It sounds more modern than it really ever has. Whether you listen to it in its native German or the English translated version that was released in the States, this is one of the greatest works of electronic ever created, and it is, in my opinion, the best album of 1978. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching. If you liked this video, make sure to give it a like down below, and subscribe to hear more from me and more updates from Bryce about music in the future. And of course, let me know what you think in the comments. Agree with anything, disagree with anything, think I forgot anything, let me know down below. We'll have plenty more videos coming soon, and you can click near my head over here to catch up with some of our previous videos, and you can hit that notification bell down below and make sure you're getting notifications for when a new video goes live. So thanks so much. I'm out.